Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. I am extremely excited for my guest today. His name is Dr. Verschuuren. Apologies if I'm messing the pronunciation up at all. And he is a human geneticist, biologist, philosopher of science, really just such an impressive resume and an encyclopedia of knowledge from the stuff that I've read and heard so far. So thank you for joining me, Dr. Verschuuren. Am I pronouncing your name right, by the way?
Yes, you do. I have heard the worst combinations of characters, but this is perfect.
Well, that's good because I'm certainly not inclined to proper pronunciation most times. But before we get into the topic today, which will be a really interesting and fascinating subject, I'm sure, for a lot of people, evolution and God, we're going right into the big one. I figured, why don't we just start with, a little bit about your background, who you are, how you got into all this, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of personal history with us.
Sure. Let me explain a little bit about my background. As you can go by my accent, I am Dutch. So I studied in the Netherlands and in other parts of Europe. As you said already, I am a human biologist specialized in human genetics. I later on studied philosophy of science. And that's when my interest came in for the interface between science and religion. Mm. When you are trained as a scientist, you only hear the science story. Mm-hmm. And people who teach you, people who surround you, they all believe in science as the only and best thing in life. Mm-hmm. And I have learned that that's not completely true. There is something to it, but not completely. So I got very much interested in evolution and in creation. Or what does God have to do with evolution? Mm-hmm. And that's where I am now. So people who are listening to us right now, they should realize that I have made a choice in life that evolution is, at this point, I think, the best theory we have. That doesn't mean there will be a better one in time, but I think it's worth considering it. And people who don't accept evolution, I can understand that. There is no one can prove that there is evolution. No one can prove that science knows everything. We assume that. So I'm on both sides somehow.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really interesting place to kick off because here you are, a very accomplished scientist. No sane person could question your credentials. And you're taking a very nuanced, subtle approach to things. And I really appreciate that because you sometimes get people who fall into, I think you were hinting at it, this camp of scientism or something like that. But from your perspective, because you said, I can understand why people may not accept evolution, but to me it seems like the best theory we have. And I'm with you on that. I do think it is the best theory, but I don't think it's quite as sure as or quite as figured out, maybe is the way to say it, as some people tend to present it. One, would you agree with that? And two, what is the proper nuanced view people should maybe have of the theory, or would you even say theories of evolution?
Let me make a distinction. You mentioned the word scientism. That means that science is everything there is. People who believe that evolution is everything there is, I call that evolutionism. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, most biologists believe in evolutionism. Mm. But that's hard to defend. If you do that, if you say that is all we have, evolution is all that counts, then I say, how do we know that evolution is all that counts? Mm-hmm. The answer must be evolution.
A little circular there, isn't it?
Yeah, but all we claim to know is based on evolution. So we get, as you said, in a vicious circle. Mm-hmm. So you cannot prove that evolution is all there is. And I find it always interesting to mention that even Charles Darwin, who protected evolution at all costs, that he at one point began to wonder. He said, and I'm quoting, which I also put in my book, The Eclipse of God, "Then with me a horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals," mm-hmm. This is Darwin, of course, "are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are convictions in such a mind?" Mm-hmm. In other words, he is really realizing, I am undermining my own theory, because I came up with the theory of natural selection and evolution. But who am I if I am just a lower animal? I'm not quoting him now. Then what is his theory worth? So by acknowledging that, he at least realized that he was also undermining his own theory. But he didn't take any consequences from that. He just kept saying that evolution is all there is, and his theory was the best there is. And that's where I'm a little skeptical.
So that, just to make sure that I have that perspective right, what Darwin was saying sounds a lot sort of like maybe Plantinga's position of naturalism being self-refuting, in the sense, all right, maybe evolution is true, but on evolution, you have no reason to trust your cognitive faculties in accepting that it's true. Is that
correct? Yeah, perfectly. Yeah, perfectly correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I just to give another example, I always laugh when someone like Lewontin, which was a famous biologist, when he said the mind is merely an illusion produced by the brain. So then we should seriously question anything that he says, if his thoughts are just illusions by his own verdict. So all these people, as you said before, they are circling around, and they can never get out of that circle unless they assume somehow certain things. And that's where I'm skeptical, and I say, please, scientists, don't reject religion. And I say to believers, please don't reject evolution. But if you do, that's a choice you have.
Well, I think that's a perfectly rational, and it's also a position that I take. So it's a nice little confirmation bias for me there. I always appreciate those when they're coming from people a lot more learned and often intelligent than I am. So I would kind of want to maybe start this conversation, unless you had anything else you wanted to add or jump in with there.
Oh no, we will probably touch that through your questions.
Yeah. So. And this is, when we're thinking about scientism or evolutionism, this is why I like the eliminativists or people like that, because they at least they're consistent, even if it's not coherent. And it makes you realize, okay, there seems to be some absurd conclusions that this worldview is leading to. So what would you say is your general worldview now that can help make sense or bridge the gap, if there even is a gap, between evolution on one hand and religion and God on the other?
I would like to use the example of solitaire on most people's computer. When people play solitaire on their computer, and I'm sure that many of you do, then I would say, where do the cards come from? Of course, from a program on your computer. Where does that program come from? From a programmer. The computer didn't make its own program. So there are two layers. Where do the cards come from, and where does that program come from? So the same question I always ask about the universe. Where does the universe come from? From the Big Bang, most people would say. And then the next question is, where does the Big Bang come from? And then we get into surprises, not from itself, as some cosmologists say, but from the computer. No, from the creator. Nothing has the power to make itself exist. For something to create itself, it would have to exist before it came into existence, which is again logically impossible. So I do the same with evolution. Where do we come from? From evolution? Probably. But ultimately, evolution can't make itself. like the universe can't create itself.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, we come from creation, from God.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I bring in always creation in my view of life. Without creation, I cannot explain the universe and I cannot explain evolution.
Mm.
And
So yeah,
go ahead.
No, so I mean, I don't want to interject too soon here, but it seems like that you're just willing to take a look at the stage that had to necessarily be set, and almost, and to a very finely tuned degree, no less, it appears, for evolution to even take hold.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So evolution cannot start from nothing. Let's put it that way. There has to be something that evolves. Mm-hmm. So evolution is how things change from one thing into another thing.
Mm-hmm.
Creation is about how something came from nothing. That's why in religion that is called God created the universe out of nothing. Mm-hmm. But most people take that nothing as something else, some weird kind of stuff that God used. God didn't use any stuff. He created something from nothing. Mm-hmm. And evolution creates something from something else.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really good way to phrase it. And I know you're a fan of Thomas Aquinas. So when we say that God created ex nihilo, it's really meaning that he was the ultimate efficient cause with no prior material cause, right?
Oh, you used the right terminology. I was very careful to bring that in, but it's really true. God is the primary cause, and we, evolution, the universe, are secondary causes. Mm-hmm. We cause things from one thing to another, but God doesn't do that. So God is outside the range of secondary causes. Mm-hmm. Secondary causes play in evolution and in the universe, but God is not part of that. And I always like to separate that very clearly. Otherwise, we get into all kind of weird thinking, and we call for all kind of problems that shouldn't exist. So when we talk about, let's say, I'm sure most people are familiar with the creation story in the book Genesis. Mm-hmm. In the Bible, even if you don't believe in Genesis, it at least tells us where things come from, how God created them from nothing, not how he created them through evolution, because there was no evolution at that time. So we can't blame the writers of Genesis that they didn't know about evolution, that we didn't know that either before Darwin or a little earlier. So I would like to always separate that. And then when people get very skeptical, they say, yeah, but when you look at the book of Genesis, isn't that old-fashioned? Isn't that long ago? Yes and no. Let me say first that if we have people who have a Protestant background, they usually read the Bible very literally. Mm. And that is hard to do with the first 2 chapters in the book of Genesis. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you allow me, I would like to explain a little bit what the book of Genesis really says about creation.
Yes, please. That would be helpful.
Yeah, some people read that as a chronological story, that God did something on day 1 and then day 2. And some people say then, yeah, day 1 is really thousands of years. But even that doesn't really make sense when you read Genesis 1. Genesis 1 basically says that God did his creative work in 2 sections. And if you ever have time, I'm talking to the audience now, if you ever have time, read the first chapter in Genesis and you will see that God does things in 2 sets. In the first 3 days, he separates things. He separates the light and the darkness. So it gives rise to day and night. On day 2, he separates the waters above from the waters below, giving rise to the sky and the sea. And on day 3, he separates the waters below from each other, thus giving rise to the dry land. That section is usually called, even by Thomas Aquinas, the work of division. Mm-hmm. And then we have a second set of 3 days. God goes back over the realms that he produced by division on the first 3 days and then populates them. On day 4, he adorns the day and the night with the sun, moon, and stars. On day 5, he populates the sky with birds and the sea with fish. And on day 6, he populates the land between the divided waters with animals and humankind. That is a twofold process. And we can even see that later. You can prove it actually in Genesis 1 verse 2. We are told that the earth was formless, void. Mm-hmm. So the work of division cures the formless problem, whereas the work of filling and adorning everything fixes the void problem. And at the end, it says the heavens and the earth were finished, that is by division, and all their multitude, that is by adornment. So that is a much better reading of that first chapter. So we don't have to say, oh, but that is so primitive to believe in Genesis 1. All that Genesis 1 is saying is all these things, birds and animals and everything, they are not divine, like it was at that time for many people around Israel. They had the golden calf, for instance, so animals were divine. The falcon was divine. And then you had the pharaohs, they used the falcons, and it was all divine, divine, divine. But Genesis says, no, they are not divine. Only God is divine. And the rest is not divine, but he created it, and it depends on him for its existence. Mm-hmm. Does that make any sense?
It makes perfect sense, and I'm really glad you went into that. First off, you have an absolutely gorgeous storytelling voice. But I was really enthralled by your take of Genesis there. But even beyond that, I think it's important for people to note that this isn't some like new translation of Genesis. You know, Augustine, one of the early church fathers, 1,500 years before Darwin, said that God could have released certain potentialities in the universe that would have unfurled over any expanse of time, right?
Correct, yeah.
And the reason I point that out is, you know, sometimes when we offer these interpretations of Genesis, which I believe are the correct interpretations, sometimes we'll say, well, you're just saying that as a retreat from evolutionary theory or modern science. But that just isn't the truth, is it?
No, that's correct. That's not the truth. Let's say evolution is just about the development of this world. And creation is about what is the origin of this world. Where does it come from? And I think that is the most important message of Genesis. And the most important message of evolution is, how did these things come along? I know for some... even for some Christians, that is hard to accept. They take that Bible very literally, and I don't want to name any special group, but I should say in certain more fundamental Protestant sections, and I'm sure there are some people among us right today, they will say that everything should be taken literally, but that is very hard to accept. There are so many different types of texts in the Bible. Some are prayers, like in the Psalms. Mm-hmm. Some are visions, like in the book of Revelation. Some are debates, like in the book of Job, where they are all debating with each other. And then there are parables, like in the Gospels from Jesus. They are not literal stories. The letters of St. Paul are more literal. And of course, the book of Acts is a historical report, and the book of Kings and Samuel and all of that, they are more historical, but don't take everything historical in the Bible. That is not fair to the book, and it's not fair to the people who wrote it.
And this is just a little bit about my background. I'm fairly I say fairly new to the church in the sense that I spent many years as an atheist or agnostic, and I also had this caricatured view of the Bible, that it was just some archaic piece of quote unquote science. And it wasn't until I really started to read a lot of the early church fathers and philosophers and people like Thomas Aquinas that I really began to realize, okay, I was not being fair to this book. I had not actually given it a fair chance of trying to read it and understand it and all of its beautiful complexity and majesty and all the truth that is actually in there, whether it is spiritual truth or recorded history, depending on which book of the Bible, what genre you're trying to read. All that came to me much later, so I'm glad that you were able to bring that out and talk about that a little bit. It helps clear up a lot of myths, and for me, what I realized, my objections to religion were really just grounded on myths that just were not true.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you came to that awareness, and I hope many more people will come to that awareness, that there is so much truth in the Bible, though it's not scientific truth, it is another kind of truth. But still, it is a truth that we cannot let go easily. If we do, we undermine ourselves.
So I think we've made, and I really like this, because I think we've made the distinction pretty clear that when you understand evolution properly, when you understand creation properly, they're really quite easy to reconcile. There's just no conflict there. And that was very easy for me to overcome as well, because I was able to look towards, kind of make that end run around evolution, if you will, and look, okay, well, evolution is great. I think it's a great theory, but what about the fine tuning of the universe? What about the universe potentially coming to being from nothing? Like, all that had to happen before evolution could even take hold, which is, I think, kind of what we're saying here. But beyond that, you hinted at sometimes people get caught up in the minutiae or certain debates that are otherwise unnecessary. What would you say are some common traps, pitfalls, or myths that people tend to either fall for or engage in that are just unnecessary when it comes to, evolution and God?
There are many traps, so I don't want to pick out one in particular, and otherwise it would be a long list of boring stories. Yeah. So what I try to do in my most recent book, which is called The Eclipse of God, I try to show how several groups of scientists, cosmologists, geneticists, biologists, neuroscientists, how they all trap themselves in their own little science and then attack religion from that. And I always say a lot of those scientists, they write all kind of books about the destiny of the world and our destiny, and they think that they are experts in everything other than their own little science. Mm-hmm. So I say I never want an electrician to fix my plumbing in the house, mm-hmm. and I don't want a plumber to fix my electricity in the house. But we read those books, even from Nobel laureates, and say, oh, that is the final truth about life. And that, I find that so dangerous. Who would want to take the thoughts of a scientist when it's not his expertise? So what I always say, if, as you said earlier already, without religion, without God, we can't even do science. Without the assumption that there is an objectively real world, science would not be possible. Mm-hmm. But without the assumption that the world is comprehensible, science would not be possible. Without the assumption that our sense perception is reliable, science would not be possible. Without the assumption that our reasoning is reliable, science would not be possible. Mm-hmm. Without the assumption that there is order and uniformity in nature, science would not be possible. So I always say, where do those assumptions come from? And you feel it coming, my answer, from God and creation. Only the order in the world has been implemented. You mentioned fine-tuning. That is a form of order. Where does that order come from? Stephen Hawking, who died just recently, he used to say there was no creation because the world had natural laws, and they created the universe. How can natural laws create the universe if they don't exist first? Where do they come from? Mm-hmm. From God, from creation.
So it seems like, and this is why I was excited to talk to you, because you have the background both in science and philosophy, that Hawking's and a lot of other people would, look at etiology, or how one physical state can lead to another physical state, but they wouldn't look at ontology. And yet they'd be so quick to condemn philosophy and say it wasn't important, and then also be so quick to make these very simple category mistakes. And I think
yeah, it's unbelievable. They reject philosophy, they reject metaphysics, but they are using their own metaphysics and their own philosophy. but how do I know that their philosophy is reliable? Not because they are scientists, for scientists are not good philosophers. Mm-hmm. So I can't trust their philosophy, but they throw Thomas Aquinas' philosophy away and say, oh, it's garbage. I wanted to use another word, but I won't say that on an open microphone. So I find that unbelievable. And in my book, The Eclipse of God, I let a lot of them talk because they have the right to be heard. Mm-hmm. And then I gradually try to pull things away from under them by saying, yeah, but this is not valid what you are saying, and that is not valid what you are saying. Mm-hmm. And of course, then I come up with my answer. And whether people accept that or not, that's up to them. But at least they can't say, I never heard of that.
Well, Dr. Verschuuren, I want to make sure that they get a chance to hear this. Your book, The Eclipse of God, and your other work, what is the best spot that people can grab that, they can follow along with the writings that you're doing? Because I know you write for other outlets, you do a lot of interviews to kind of follow along with you and make sure that they get it. They can pick up some of your work.
I think the best place to find it is www and then Genesis PC. I assume most people know how to spell Genesis. Mm-hmm. And PC stands for publishing company or personal computer, whatever. genesispc.com/books. BOOKS. I spell it because my accent may interfere. www.genesispc.com/books.
And I'll make it very easy for everybody and include the link in the show notes page directly to your work as well.
Oh, you are great.
Of course. Well, Dr. Verschuuren, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I want to thank you for taking the time, and I hope we get to do a part 2 in the future.
Yes, and I say you put the things right together, and you put it in the right terminology. That is great to talk with someone who has that background.
Well, thank you for that.
I loved it.
Very high compliment coming from you. I appreciate that.
Okay, good luck with your program, and it was my pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfoud. Good day.